Welcome to a journey into the wild, where the beauty of nature is overshadowed by the unknown lurking in its shadows. These are not just campfire tales. They are real experiences that remind us of the mysterious and sometimes terrifying nature of the wilderness. So, grab a blanket, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for 10 spine-chilling camping stories that will haunt your nights and leave you questioning every rustle in the woods. The Blackout Mystery at Todd Lake. The sun was setting over Todd Lake, painting the sky in strokes of orange and lavender. The water mirrored the warm hues, casting a serene glow over the campsite. Jake had always found solace in nature, and tonight was no exception. Joining him were John and Mary, two friends he had met at a local hiking club. They were strangers just a month ago, but the shared love for adventure had quickly bonded them. The trio set up their small camp, a couple of tents, a portable grill, and a crackling fire. As darkness fell, the stars emerged, filling the sky with a dazzling spectacle. Jake took a sip of his beer and leaned back in his camping chair, basking in the tranquility. "You picked a perfect spot, Jake," Mary said, her auburn hair catching the firelight. "This is just magical." John grinned, raising his beer. To Todd Lake, and to new friendships. They clinked their bottles, the sound echoing briefly across the still water. Hours passed with laughter and stories, but as the night deepened, an unspoken tension began to creep into the air. It was subtle at first, the occasional rustle in the woods, a breeze that felt too cold for the season. "Did you hear that?" Mary asked suddenly, sitting upright. "It's probably just an animal," John replied, but his voice carried an edge of unease. Jake turned his flashlight toward the tree lean, its beams slicing through the darkness. The forest stood still, shadowy and unyielding. "Nothing there," he said, though his stomach nodded. They decided to brush it off, returning to their conversation. Yet, the feeling of being watched lingered, prickling the back of their necks like a silent alarm. Around midnight, Mary suggested calling it a night. The fire was reduced to glowing embers, and the crisp air was now biting. The next thing Jake remembered was waking up on cold, damp ground. His head throbbed, and his limbs felt heavy as if weighted by unseen hands. Slowly, he opened his eyes, finding himself surrounded by dense woods. The campsite was nowhere in sight. Panic surged through him. "John? Mary?" he croaked, his voice echoing faintly. A groan came from nearby. Jake scrambled toward the sound, finding John sprawled against a tree, pale and disoriented. "What happened?" John murmured. "I don't know," Jake admitted, helping him sit up. They looked around, their flashlights somehow still attached to their belts. The beams revealed scattered leaves and nothing familiar. A few minutes later, they found Mary lying on a bed of moss, shivering but conscious. "We were at the camp, and then," Mary trailed off, her face pale. None of them could piece together what had occurred. Checking their phones revealed something even more unsettling. They were over an hour away from Todd Lake, with no memory of how they got there. Worse yet, their watches showed a time discrepancy. According to them, it had only been 20 minutes since they'd said goodnight. The walk back to the campsite was harrowing. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, and the forest felt alive with unseen eyes. An inexplicable nausea settled over them, a queasy feeling that grew stronger the closer they got to the lake. When they finally reached the campsite, it looked untouched. The embers of the fire still glowed faintly. Their tents stood as they'd left them, and yet the atmosphere was wrong. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if they were intruding on something ancient and malevolent. "We should leave," Mary whispered, clutching her stomach. "Agreed," John said, already packing his gear. But as they hurriedly gathered their belongings, Jake noticed something unusual by the lakeshore. A series of small, concentric circles had been etched into the sand, perfectly symmetrical. He called the others over, their unease deepening as they examined the strange markings. "What could have made these?" Mary asked, her voice trembling. John shook his head. "No idea, but we're not sticking around to find out." As they loaded their packs, the nausea intensified, accompanied by a high-pitched ringing in their ears. Then, All at once, the forest fell silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just an oppressive, unnatural quiet. "Run," Jake whispered, though he didn't know why. Instinct took over, and they bolted toward the trailhead. They reached their cars just as dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the treetops. The warmth of the sun should have brought comfort, but the trio sat in stunned silence, their minds racing to comprehend the night's events. As they drove away, none of them dared to look back. Over the next few days, Jake couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The nausea persisted, along with strange dreams of the lake and those concentric circles. When he finally shared his experience with a local historian, her face paled. Those circles, they match descriptions from Appalachian folklore. Some say they're a warning, others, an invitation. But the stories always end the same. People vanish, or they come back changed. Jake's blood ran cold. He hadn't told her about the sickness or the strange buzzing that still echoed faintly in his ears. He hadn't told her that he'd woken up that morning with sand under his fingernails, though he hadn't touched the lake. Weeks later, John and Mary stopped responding to his calls. When he drove to their homes, he found them abandoned, as if they had left in a hurry. Jake was left alone with his memories and the creeping fear that whatever happened that night wasn't over. Late one evening, as he sat by his window staring into the dark woods beyond his backyard, the ringing in his ears grew louder. And then he saw them, faint, glowing circles in the distance, impossibly perfect and waiting for him to follow. The Bennington Triangle dread. The Green Mountains of Vermont stretched endlessly before Thomas, their lush, rolling peaks an invitation he couldn't resist. A solo hiker by nature, Thomas thrived on solitude, the rhythmic crunch of his boots on the trail, and the whisper of wind through the pines. The stories about the Bennington Triangle, a region infamous for unexplained disappearances, were nothing more than campfire tales to him, fodder for locals and thrill seekers. That morning, as he set out from the trailhead, the air was crisp, carrying the earthy aroma of damp soil and fallen leaves. Thomas adjusted his backpack, ensuring his supplies were secure, and began his ascent. The trail, narrow and winding, offered glimpses of the valley below through breaks in the foliage. Sunlight filtered through the trees, dappling the path in golden light. By midday, he reached a clearing. Sitting on a moss-covered boulder, he unpacked a sandwich and water, savoring the tranquility. Birds chirped in the distance, and a gentle breeze rustled the treetops. It was perfect, or so he thought. As the afternoon wore on, the forest seemed to change. The sunlight that once danced playfully among the trees grew dimmer, as though the canopy had thickened. The air turned cooler, and the cheerful chirping of birds gave way to an unsettling silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Thomas paused, glancing around. The trail, once so clear, now seemed faint and overgrown. Had he missed a marker? He pulled out his map and compass, but something about the silence gnawed at him, fraying his nerves. "Relax," he muttered to himself, stuffing the map back into his pocket. Yet his pace quickened, boots crunching against the leaf-strewn ground with a nervous urgency. The deeper he went, the darker the woods became. Shadows pooled under ancient trees, their gnarled roots twisting like skeletal hands. Every so often, he'd catch movement out of the corner of his eye, a flicker of shadow, a whisper of motion. But when he turned, there was nothing. "Hello?" he called, his voice swallowed by the oppressive stillness. No answer came. The stories of the Bennington Triangle surfaced in his mind. Hunters who vanished without a trace, hikers who wandered off established trails never to be seen again. Rationality fought with instinct. The wilderness was vast and unpredictable. Accidents happened, but this felt different. It felt intentional. The first real sign of danger came as dusk began to settle. Thomas found himself on a narrow ridge, the drop-off plunging into a misty abyss. The trail he was following simply ended, fading into the undergrowth. Heart-pounding, he doubled back, but nothing looked familiar. That's when he heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a growl or a deep exhale. He froze. It came again, closer this time. Turning slowly, he scanned the woods, his hand instinctively reaching for the small knife at his belt. Between the trees, something moved. Not a bear, not a deer. Something taller, more humanoid, but distorted. Its form seemed to ripple, as though the very air around it was rejecting its presence. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as the figure melted back into the shadows. Panic set in. He broke into a run, branches slapping against his face and tearing at his clothes. The growl followed, growing louder and more guttural, but when he glanced over his shoulder, nothing was there. He didn't stop until he stumbled into a small clearing. The clearing offered no comfort. In its center stood a lone cairn of stones, stacked impossibly high and perfectly balanced. Around it, the ground was bare, devoid of leaves or vegetation, as if nature itself had recoiled. Thomas circled it warily, his instincts screaming at him to leave, but something about the cairn held his gaze. It felt wrong, ancient, and charged with an energy he couldn't name. A sharp pain shot through his head, forcing him to his knees. Images flashed behind his eyes. Shadowy figures, spiraling voids, and a sense of falling into nothingness. When the pain subsided, he found himself staring at his hands. They were trembling, and his fingernails were stained with dirt. The growling returned, this time accompanied by a faint, rhythmic chanting. The words were unintelligible, but they carried an oppressive weight, as if the forest itself was speaking. Thomas backed away from the cairn, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had to leave. He turned to run, but the clearing seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. No matter where he looked, the edge of the forest remained the same distance away. The chanting grew louder, the growl deeper. Tears streamed down his face as he stumbled forward, blindly seeking an escape. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Thomas awoke at dawn, sprawled on the forest floor. His body ached, and his clothes were damp with dew. Slowly, he sat up, finding himself at the edge of the trailhead where his hike had begun. The cairn, the growling, the chanting, all gone. Only the lingering dread remained, a cold weight in his chest. He returned to town, shaken but alive. When he recounted his experience to a local guide, the man's face darkened. "You're not the first to come back with a story like that," the guide said. "Most don't come back at all." Thomas tried to move on, but the experience stayed with him. At night, he dreamed of the cairn, of the growling, and of the chanting that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth. He avoided the woods, but the woods didn't avoid him. Weeks later, while sitting on his porch, Thomas noticed a stack of stones in his front yard. They were perfectly balanced, impossibly high, and surrounded by bare, lifeless ground. A chill ran through him as the wind carried a faint, familiar growl. Escape from the desert RV. The dry heat of the high desert was suffocating, even as the sun dipped below the horizon. Clara adjusted her bandana, trying to shield her face from the relentless wind that carried grains of sand like tiny daggers. She had come to the remote desert festival seeking music and freedom, but found herself hopelessly lost after wandering away from the main grounds. Her phone was dead, the battery drained from hours of capturing photos and videos of dazzling light displays and eccentric performers. The faint glow of the festival's lights was a distant memory now, swallowed by the vast expanse of desert. Clara's boots crunched against the hard-packed sand as she trudged forward, her water bottle nearly empty. Then she saw it, the faint outline of an RV, parked on the edge of a rocky outcrop. Relief washed over her. She picked up her pace, her heart racing with the hope of finding help. As she approached, the RV's door swung open, and a man stepped out. He was in his mid-40s, wiry and sunburned, with a weathered face that suggested a lifetime under the desert sun. His smile seemed warm enough, though his eyes lingered on Clara a moment too long. "You okay?" he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still night air. "I got lost," Clara replied, her throat dry. "Can I borrow your phone? Or maybe get some water?" The man nodded, gesturing for her to come closer. "Sure thing. Got some supplies inside." Name's Ed. You're lucky you found me. It's easy to get turned around out here. Clara hesitated, her instincts pricking at her. But the thirst and exhaustion outweighed her caution. She climbed the short steps into the RV, where a blast of cooler air greeted her. The interior was cluttered but cozy, with faded upholstery and a faint smell of gasoline. A jug of water sat on the small counter, alongside a few mismatched glasses. Ed poured her a glass and handed it to her with a crooked smile. Take your time. You'll be back to the festival in no time. Clara drank greedily, the cool liquid reviving her parched body. She looked around, noting the odd assortment of items scattered throughout the RV. Rusted tools, a half-disassembled radio, and what looked like a stack of festival wristbands. Something about the scene felt off, but she brushed it aside. She was just grateful to have found shelter. Thank you, she said, setting the glass down. Do you have a phone I can use? Ed's smile faltered for a moment before returning. Phone's out of service, unfortunately, but you're welcome to stay here until morning. It's safer than wandering around out there. Clara's unease grew. I should probably keep moving. The festival can't be that far. Ed's expression darkened, his friendly demeanor slipping. You're not going anywhere tonight. It's too dangerous. Her heart pounded as he stepped closer, his presence suddenly looming. Clara's eyes darted to the door, calculating her chances of escape. But before she could make a move, Ed's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist in an iron grip. Let go, she shouted, struggling against him. He didn't respond, his smile now twisted into something menacing. With a burst of adrenaline, Clara twisted free, grabbing the empty glass from the counter and smashing it against his arm. He yelped in pain, and she seized the opportunity to bolt for the door. The desert night enveloped her as she ran, the sharp rocks and thorny plants tearing at her legs. She didn't look back, but she could hear Ed's shouts and the heavy thud of his boots chasing after her. Clara's lungs burned as she pushed forward, her only goal to get as far from the RV as possible. The terrain grew rougher, the ground littered with jagged stones and cacti. She stumbled, falling hard and scraping her palms, but quickly scrambled back to her feet. In the distance, she spotted a faint light. Not the warm glow of the festival, but something harsher, artificial. Desperation propelled her toward it. As she drew closer, she realized it was an old, abandoned gas station, its lone fluorescent bulb flickering weakly. She burst through the broken door, her chest heaving. The inside was dilapidated, with empty shelves and shattered windows, but it offered a semblance of safety. Clara crouched behind the counter, trying to steady her breathing. Outside, she could hear Ed's voice calling out, mocking and taunting. You can't hide forever, sweetheart. There's nowhere to go. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. Her hand closed around a rusted tire iron, its weight reassuring in her grip. She held her breath, waiting. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. Ed's silhouette appeared in the doorway, his figure backlit by the flickering light. He stepped inside, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the darkened room. Clara didn't wait. With a scream, she lunged from her hiding spot, swinging the tire iron with all her strength. It connected with a sickening crack, and Ed crumpled to the ground, groaning. She didn't stop to see if he was unconscious or worse. Dropping the tire iron, she sprinted out of the gas station and into the night, her legs fueled by sheer terror. Clara eventually found her way back to the festival grounds, stumbling into the neon-lit chaos like a ghost. Her friends were horrified by her appearance, but she offered no explanation beyond, "I need to leave." Days later, as she sat in the safety of her apartment, the events replayed in her mind. She couldn't shake the image of Ed's twisted smile or the sound of his boots on the desert floor. But the most chilling detail was what she found in her pocket when she emptied her festival jacket. A wristband that wasn't hers, its plastic clasp stained with dried blood. The phantom in the red plaid shirt. The crisp winter air nipped at the group of scouts as they gathered around the campfire, their laughter and chatter filling the otherwise silent forest. The remote camp in the heart of the Adirondacks was meant to provide a bonding experience, a chance to build character and test their mettle against the wilderness. For most of the boys, it was their first time spending a weekend away from the comforts of home. Night had fallen, and the fire pit blazed, crackling logs sending sparks into the star-filled sky. The scoutmaster, Mr. Hargrove, sat at the edge of the circle, telling a tale about a local legend, the ghost of Red Plaid. "They say he was a logger from the old days," Mr. Hargrove said, his voice low and dramatic. "He vanished one winter night after going out alone to cut wood. Some say he froze to death. Others believe he was lost in the storm. But on nights like this, when the snow falls heavy and the woods grow quiet, some people swear they see him, wandering in his red plaid shirt." A shiver ran through the group, though whether it was from the cold or the story, no one could say. Lucas, the youngest of the scouts, tugged his blanket tighter around his shoulders. "That's just a story, right?" he asked, his voice trembling. Mr. Hargrove smiled. "Of course it is. Now, let's get some sleep. We've got a long hike tomorrow." The scouts dispersed to their tents, their laughter fading as they settled in for the night. The fire burned low, casting long shadows that danced across the snow-covered ground. It was sometime past midnight when Lucas woke to the sound of faint footsteps crunching in the snow. He sat up, his breath visible in the frigid air. The tent was silent except for the soft snores of his tentmate, Jake. Hesitant, Lucas peeked through the small gap in the tent flap. Near the fire pit stood a man. He wore a red plaid shirt, the pattern faintly visible in the moonlight. His back was to Lucas, and he seemed to be staring into the dying embers of the fire. Lucas's heart raced. "Mr. Hargrove," he whispered, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he turned slightly, revealing a pale, gaunt face that sent a chill down Lucas's spine. The man's eyes glinted, reflecting the faint light like a predator in the dark. Lucas pulled back into the tent, his hands shaking. "Jake, wake up," he hissed, shaking his friend awake. Jake groaned, rubbing his eyes. "What?" "There's someone out there," Lucas whispered, "by the fire pit." Jake frowned but grabbed his flashlight. The two boys crept to the edge of the tent, peering out together. Jake clicked on the flashlight, its beams slicing through the darkness. But the man was gone. The snow around the fire pit was untouched, pristine. "There's no one there," Jake said, his voice annoyed. "Go back to sleep, Lucas." Lucas didn't argue. He crawled back into his sleeping bag, but his mind raced. Had he imagined it? The following morning, the campsite was abuzz with activity as the scouts prepared for their hike. Lucas hesitated to mention what he'd seen, but as they ate breakfast, another boy spoke up. "Hey, did anyone hear footsteps last night?" asked Ben, one of the older scouts. "I thought I saw someone walking by my tent." Lucas's stomach dropped. "I saw him too," he blurted out, "by the fire pit. He was wearing a red plaid shirt." The group fell silent. Mr. Hargrove chuckled nervously. "You boys are letting my story get to you. No one's out here except us." But Lucas wasn't convinced, and neither was Ben. Throughout the hike, the two boys exchanged uneasy glances, both feeling as though unseen eyes were watching them. That night, the snow began to fall heavily, blanketing the forest in an eerie silence. The boys huddled in their tents, the warmth of the fire unable to reach them. Lucas struggled to sleep, every creak of the trees and gust of wind setting his nerves on edge. Then, just past midnight, the footsteps returned. Slow, deliberate crunches in the snow. Lucas held his breath, his heart pounding in his ears. He nudged Jake, who groaned but didn't wake. Summoning his courage, Lucas unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The man in the red plaid shirt was back, standing closer this time. His pale face was partially obscured by the falling snow, but his eyes, those cold, reflective eyes, locked onto Lucas. Lucas froze, his breath catching in his throat. The man raised a hand, as if beckoning him, but Lucas's instinct screamed to stay put. He fumbled for his flashlight and shone it directly at the figure. The man vanished. No sound, no movement, just gone. Lucas bolted upright, shaking Jake awake. He was there. I saw him. Jake groaned but sat up, his face pale as he saw Lucas's terror. The two boys scrambled out of the tent, waking the others and Mr. Hargrove. When the group investigated, they found no footprints, no evidence of anyone near the campsite. The snow was undisturbed, a pristine sheet under the moonlight. But Lucas knew what he'd seen, and so did Ben, who confessed to hearing the footsteps again that night. Mr. Hargrove tried to calm the boys, insisting it was just their imaginations running wild. But even he couldn't explain the odd chill that hung over the camp or the way the fire refused to stay lit that night. The scouts left the campsite the next morning, their hike back to the trailhead unusually quiet. As they loaded into the vans, Lucas glanced back at the forest one last time. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a flash of red among the trees. Years later, Lucas would recount the story to friends, his voice tinged with both fear and fascination. He'd heard rumors of other campers seeing the man in the red plaid shirt, always on snowy nights, always near a dying fire. And though he never returned to that campsite, he couldn't shake the feeling that the phantom of the red plaid shirt was still out there, waiting for the next unwitting camper to wander into his woods. Dancing lights by the riverbank. The air was crisp and damp, the kind of chill that sank into your bones as night fell. A group of 4 friends sat along the riverbank, their catfishing rods propped up in the mud. The water glistened under the faint moonlight, rippling gently as if breathing. Beyond the river, the dense forest stretched endlessly, a black void dotted with occasional rustling from unseen creatures. "This is the life," Joe said, reclining against his tackle box. "Just us, the river, and the promise of a big one." "Speak for yourself," Maria quipped, pulling her coat tighter around her. "It's freezing out here." Alex and Beth chuckled, their voices mixing with the soft gurgle of the river. The 4 had been coming to this spot for years, drawn by the solitude and the rare thrill of reeling in a monster catfish. Tonight was no different, except for the unease that seemed to creep in with the fog rolling off the water. "Did you guys hear that?" Beth asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. She leaned forward, peering into the dark woods across the river. "Hear what?" Alex replied, his hand gripping his rod instinctively. "I don't know. Something moving, I think." The group fell silent, listening intently. The usual nighttime sounds of crickets and distant owls seemed muffled, as though the world was holding its breath. Then, it happened. A faint light appeared across the river, hovering just above the ground. It was soft and golden, like a lantern, but it moved smoothly, almost gracefully, weaving between the trees. "What the hell is that?" Joe muttered, sitting upright. Before anyone could answer, another light appeared, then another. Soon, a half-dozen glowing orbs danced across the water's edge. They moved in erratic patterns, darting close to one another before spreading out like fireflies in a synchronized ballet. "It's probably fireflies," Alex offered, though his voice betrayed his doubt. "Fireflies don't move like that," Maria said, her eyes fixed on the lights. "And they're not that bright." The friends watched in silence as the lights grew bolder, moving closer to the water's surface. Then, one orb broke away from the rest, shooting straight up into the sky. It stopped abruptly at the top of a towering tree, its glow casting eerie shadows on the branches. Beth gasped. "There's no way that's natural." "Maybe it's a drone," Joe suggested, though his tone was far from confident. "You know, those things people use for light shows? In the middle of nowhere?" Maria countered, shaking her head. "No way." As they debated, the lights seemed to react, clustering together before drifting closer to the riverbank where the group sat. The golden glow reflected off the water, illuminating the friends' startled faces. "They're coming this way," Alex whispered, his grip tightening on his fishing rod. "Don't move," Maria said. "Just don't." The lights hovered above the water, close enough now to reveal their texture, if it could even be called that. They weren't solid, but rather seemed to shimmer and ripple, like liquid gold suspended in midair. One orb came within a few feet of Joe, who instinctively reached out. "Joe, don't!" Beth hissed. Before his fingers could make contact, the orb darted away, joining the others in an upward spiral. The lights spun faster and faster, creating a vortex of gold before suddenly vanishing with a faint pop, leaving the riverbank plunged into darkness. The group sat frozen, the silence deafening. Even the usual sounds of the night seemed reluctant to return. "What just happened?" Maria finally asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Alex said, still staring at the spot where the lights had disappeared. "But I'm not staying to find out." The others quickly agreed, packing their gear with trembling hands. The trek back to the car was tense, each shadow and snap of a twig setting their nerves on edge. By the time they reached the safety of the vehicle, their breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air doing little to calm their racing hearts. In the days that followed, the group tried to make sense of what they'd seen. Maria scoured the internet, finding stories of similar phenomena, accounts of dancing lights or will-o'-the-wisps that led travelers astray. Joe suggested returning to the riverbank to investigate further, but the idea was quickly shot down. Beth couldn't shake the feeling that they had been watched, not by the lights, but by something else. She'd had nightmares of glowing eyes in the forest, of shadowy figures moving just out of reach. Weeks turned into months, and while life resumed its normal pace, none of them returned to the riverbank. The memory of the lights lingered, a haunting reminder of the night the ordinary became something inexplicable. Years later, when Joe finally convinced a different group of friends to visit the same spot, he found it changed. The river still flowed, the forest still loomed, but the air felt heavier, as if charged with an unseen energy. They saw no lights that night, but Joe swore he could feel them watching, waiting for the right moment to return. Elephant havoc in the desert. The Okavango Delta in Botswana was a marvel of nature, a lush oasis sprawling across the Kalahari Desert. Tourists from around the globe flocked to its breathtaking scenery and abundant wildlife. For Julie, Mark, and their two friends, Sarah and Luke, it was a dream come true. A week of camping in the wild, away from the noise of civilization. They had hired a guide, Paul, who had years of experience navigating the Delta. He was their safety net, ensuring they followed every rule to the letter. But one rule, Paul emphasized more than any other: no citrus fruits in camp. "Why not?" Mark had asked, munching on an orange as they set up their tents. "Elephants," Paul replied, his tone grave. "They have a keen sense of smell, and citrus drives them mad. If they catch a whiff, they'll stop at nothing to find it." The group nodded, uneasy but intrigued. They packed their oranges and lemons into an airtight fridge in the supply vehicle, reassuring Paul that they'd comply. The first 2 nights were magical. The camp buzzed with the sounds of nature, the distant roar of lions, the chatter of nocturnal birds, and the occasional splash of water as hippos waded nearby. The group spent their evenings around a campfire, sharing stories under a blanket of stars. But on the 3rd night, the air shifted. It began with a faint rustling in the distance. Sarah, sipping her tea by the fire, froze. "Did you hear that?" "Probably just a zebra or something," Mark said, dismissive. But Paul's face darkened. "That's no zebra," he said, standing abruptly. Everyone quiet. The rustling grew louder, punctuated by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Then came the low, guttural rumble, a sound that vibrated through the ground and into their chests. "Elephant," Paul whispered, his voice taut. "Stay calm." The group followed his gaze toward the tree line. A massive bull elephant emerged, its tusks gleaming in the moonlight. Its trunk swung purposefully as it sniffed the air. The beast stopped, its ears flaring as it turned toward the campsite. "The fridge," Paul muttered under his breath. The elephant lumbered forward, its stride slow but deliberate. Paul motioned for everyone to move behind the vehicle. "Stay low and don't make a sound," he instructed. The group crouched behind the truck, their hearts pounding as the elephant approached the fridge. It examined the metal box with its trunk, puffing loudly. Then, with shocking force, it shoved the fridge, sending it crashing to the ground. The airtight seal broke, and the scent of citrus filled the air. The elephant's demeanor changed instantly. It trumpeted loudly, a deafening sound that sent shivers down their spines. It stomped its massive feet, crushing the cooler and scattering its contents. Oranges and lemons rolled across the dirt, and the elephant began to devour them with frenzied enthusiasm. "It's too close," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" Paul's eyes darted around, calculating. "We stay put and wait for it to finish. If we startle it, things will get worse." The elephant's destruction didn't stop at the fridge. Its tusks tore through one of the tents, scattering sleeping bags and supplies. It knocked over the fire pit, sending embers flying. The group watched helplessly as their campsite was reduced to chaos. After what felt like an eternity, the elephant let out a final snort and lumbered back into the trees, its footsteps fading into the night. The group emerged from their hiding spot, surveying the wreckage in stunned silence. "This could have been worse," Paul said grimly. "Never underestimate the wild." The following morning, they worked to salvage what they could, their nerves still frayed. Paul radioed for assistance, and a backup vehicle was dispatched to bring them fresh supplies. As they waited, another group of tourists arrived at the camp, their SUV stuck in the sandy terrain a few miles away. The newcomers decided to walk to the main camp for help. Paul's warning echoed in the air, "Stay with your vehicle." But the group ignored him, venturing into the wilderness on foot. Hours later, their screams pierced the quiet. When Paul and the others arrived, they found the SUV's shattered windows and claw marks on the metal. Blood streaked the ground, leading into the dense bush. No one was ever found. The group left the Delta 2 days later, their excitement replaced by a somber respect for the wild. Julie couldn't shake the image of the elephant's frenzied rampage, nor the fate of the unlucky tourists. Nature, they realized, was neither kind nor cruel. It was simply indifferent, its power both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Years later, Julie would recount the story to friends, her voice tinged with both fear and wonder. And whenever she saw an orange or lemon, she'd remember the havoc that a single whiff of citrus could unleash in the heart of the African wilderness. Cryptic warnings in the night. The moon hung high over the sprawling adventure center, its silvery glow casting long shadows across the open field where the group had pitched their tents. The night was supposed to be a peaceful culmination of their camping trip, a final evening under the stars before heading back to the dormitories. Teachers Ms. Grant and Mr. Hall kept a watchful eye on the students, their laughter and chatter echoing in the cool night air. As the campfire crackled, one of the boys, Ethan, was telling a ghost story that had everyone leaning in, wide-eyed and spooked. The tension broke with nervous laughter, and Ms. Grant glanced at her watch. "All right, kids, 10 more minutes before lights out," she announced. The students groaned but didn't argue. The night was clear, the air tinged with the comforting scent of pine. Nothing felt out of the ordinary. Until he appeared. It started as a faint rustling in the bushes at the edge of the clearing. Then came the shuffle of footsteps, uneven and deliberate. Miss Grant's head snapped toward the sound, and she stood up, squinting into the darkness. "Hello?" she called out, her voice firm but cautious. From the shadows emerged a man. He was disheveled, his clothes stained and wrinkled. He clutched a plastic grocery bag in one hand, its contents unclear. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, and his movements jerky, as though he hadn't slept in days. The chatter around the campfire ceased. The students stared, their youthful excitement quickly turning to unease. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," the man rasped. "Just don't go near the woods tonight." The statement hung in the air like smoke. Miss Grant exchanged a look with Mr. Hall, who stepped forward, his broad frame imposing. "Sir, this is private property," Mr. Hall said evenly. "You need to leave." The man's eyes darted around the group. "You don't understand. They come out when it's quiet. Stay by the fire. Don't leave the light." "Who?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling despite his bravado. The man didn't answer. Instead, he dropped the bag at his feet and backed away, his gaze fixed on the dark woods beyond the clearing. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the trees. For a moment, no one moved. The bag lay where he'd left it, an ominous reminder of his cryptic warning. "What the hell was that about?" one of the boys muttered. Miss Grant forced a smile, though her unease was evident. "Probably just a drifter. Nothing to worry about. Mr. Hall and I will keep watch. Everyone into your tents." The students obeyed, but the nervous energy was palpable. Whispers carried through the campsite as they zipped themselves into their sleeping bags. An hour later, the fire had dwindled to embers, and the campsite was silent. Miss Grant sat by the fire pit, her flashlight casting a faint glow. Mr. Hall patrolled the perimeter, his eyes scanning the tree line. The bag remained untouched, neither of them willing to open it. "What do you think he meant?" Miss Grant whispered when Mr. Hall returned. "Probably just a scare tactic. Or he's unwell," Mr. Hall replied, though his tone lacked conviction. A sudden sound cut through the quiet, a low, guttural growl. Both teachers froze. The noise came from the woods, deep and primal. It wasn't a coyote, nor anything else they'd heard before. Miss Grant gripped her flashlight tighter. "Stay here," Mr. Hall said, moving toward the sound. "Are you crazy?" she hissed, grabbing his arm. "We need to call for help." But their radios were back in the dormitories. The camp was isolated, far from cell service, and the only road was a rugged path barely suitable for vehicles. They were alone. The growl came again, closer this time. From the woods emerged two gleaming eyes, reflecting the faint firelight. Then another pair appeared, and another. The teachers backed away slowly, their breaths shallow. From the largest shadow stepped a hulking figure, its outline vaguely human but distorted. Its limbs were elongated, its head tilted unnaturally. The creature paused at the edge of the clearing, sniffing the air. "Into the dorms." "Now," Mr. Hall ordered. Miss Grant didn't argue. They roused the students quietly but urgently, guiding them toward the dormitories. The creatures didn't follow but remained at the edge of the woods, their glowing eyes watching as the group retreated. Once inside, they barricaded the doors and windows, sitting in tense silence as the night stretched on. The growls and shuffling outside persisted for hours before fading with the dawn. The following morning, the campsite was undisturbed, as though the night's events had been a fever dream. Only the bag remained. Inside were a collection of bones and tufts of fur, alongside a handwritten note. "They are drawn to noise and movement. Leave while you can." The teachers packed up the group and left the adventure center that day. They filed a report with local authorities, but no signs of the creatures were found. The students would talk about that night for years, their stories evolving into urban legends. But for Ms. Grant and Mr. Hall, the memory remained sharp and terrifying. Not all threats are supernatural, they would remind themselves. But sometimes, the real danger lies in the things that defy explanation. A father's heroic save. The remote campsite was a picture of serenity. Towering pines surrounded the clearing, their rustling branches harmonizing with the gentle murmur of a nearby creek. For the Daniels family, it was the perfect escape from the bustle of city life. Aaron, their 7-year-old son, was especially thrilled, darting around the site with boundless energy. "Stay close, Aaron," his mother, Claire, called out as she arranged food on the picnic table. "We're far from any help out here." "I'm just exploring," Aaron replied, waving a stick he'd picked up from the forest floor. His father, Greg, glanced up from pitching the tent. "Don't wander too far, buddy. We won't be able to hear you if you go too deep into the trees." Aaron nodded, but was already lost in his own little adventure, chasing a butterfly near the edge of the clearing. The parents exchanged a knowing smile, confident in the safety of their remote retreat. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the family settled in for dinner. Laughter filled the campsite, the warmth of the fire reflecting in their eyes. But as the evening wore on, Aaron's absence stretched uncomfortably long. "Aaron?" Claire called, her voice tinged with concern. There was no response. Greg stood up, his face tightening. "Aaron, come back now. It's getting dark." Still nothing. Panic set in quickly. Greg grabbed a flashlight and Claire's hand. Together, they began combing the immediate area, their voices echoing into the encroaching darkness. The flashlight beam cut through the trees, revealing nothing but gnarled roots and fallen leaves. "We need to split up," Greg said, his tone urgent. "Stay within shouting distance." Claire hesitated but nodded, her maternal instincts warring with her fear. She headed east toward the creek while Greg moved west, deeper into the woods. Minutes turned into an agonizing hour. Just as Greg was about to double back, he heard voices. A man's voice, unfamiliar and calm, drifted through the trees. "You must be Aaron. Don't worry, I'll get you back to your parents." Greg froze, his heart racing. He quickened his pace, the beam of his flashlight bouncing erratically. Through the trees, he spotted a parked pickup truck on a narrow dirt path. Standing beside it was a man in a worn jacket, his hand resting on Aaron's shoulder. "Hey!" Greg shouted, breaking into a run. "What are you doing with my son?" The man looked up, startled. His grip on Aaron tightened momentarily before he released the boy. "He was lost," the man said, his voice calm but guarded. "I was just helping him out." Greg reached them in seconds, pulling Aaron close. "You passed our campsite," Greg said, his tone icy. "If you wanted to help, why didn't you bring him back?" The man's eyes flickered with something unspoken. "It's easy to get turned around out here. I didn't mean any harm." Greg didn't believe him. "Thank you," he said tightly, ushering Aaron away. "But we've got it from here." The man's expression darkened. "Be careful out here," he said, climbing into his truck. "You never know who you might run into." The engine roared to life, and the truck disappeared down the dirt road, its taillights vanishing into the night. Back at the campsite, Aaron clung to Claire, tears streaming down his face. "He said he was going to take me to a safer place," Aaron sobbed. But he didn't stop at the campsite. He kept driving. Greg's blood ran cold. The man's intentions were clear now, and the thought of what could have happened if he hadn't intercepted the truck made his stomach churn. "You're safe now," Claire whispered, holding Aaron tightly. Greg sat by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames. He kept his flashlight and a camping knife within arm's reach, his ears tuned to every rustle in the woods. They didn't sleep that night, and when the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Greg wasted no time packing up the campsite. As they drove away, Aaron dozed in the back seat, clutching his stuffed bear. Claire placed a hand on Greg's arm. "You saved him," she said softly. Greg didn't respond, his grip on the steering wheel tight. He couldn't shake the man's parting words or the eerie feeling that they had narrowly escaped something far worse than they could comprehend. Years later, Aaron would recall that night as the moment he realized how fiercely his father would protect him. For Greg, it was a haunting reminder that the wilderness wasn't the only danger lurking in the dark. Sometimes, the real threats came from those who hid behind a facade of kindness, waiting for the right moment to strike. The Greek Hitchhiker's Nightmare. The sun was setting over the rugged hills of rural Greece, casting a golden glow across the winding road that stretched into the horizon. For Daniel, an adventurous hitchhiker in his mid-20s, this was the kind of moment he lived for. Backpack slung over one shoulder, he stuck out his thumb, hoping for a ride to the next village. The day had been long, and his legs ached from hours of walking. When the sound of an approaching vehicle broke the stillness, Daniel turned to see an old, battered sedan slowing down. The driver was an older man, perhaps in his 60s, with silver hair and a kind smile. He rolled down the window and gestured for Daniel to approach. "Where are you heading?" the man asked in accented English. "To the next village," Daniel replied, grateful for the chance to rest his feet. The man nodded. "Hop in. I'm going that way." Daniel hesitated for a moment, a flicker of caution tugging at him, but the man's friendly demeanor eased his concerns. He climbed into the passenger seat, setting his backpack at his feet. "Thank you," Daniel said, buckling his seatbelt. The man simply smiled, his eyes briefly meeting Daniel's before returning to the road. At first, the ride was pleasant. The man introduced himself as Nikos, a retired fisherman who now spent his days tending a small olive grove. He asked Daniel about his travels, nodding with interest as the younger man described his backpacking journey across Europe. The radio played soft Greek folk music, and the warm breeze drifting through the open windows added to the peaceful atmosphere. But as the miles stretched on, something began to feel off. Nikos's questions grew more personal. He asked if Daniel was traveling alone, how much money he carried, and whether anyone knew his exact whereabouts. The friendliness in his tone began to feel forced, and his grip on the steering wheel tightened. Daniel's unease grew when Nikos passed a sign for the village Daniel had mentioned. Wasn't that the turn?" Daniel asked, his voice tinged with nervousness. Nikos waved him off. "A shortcut. Trust me." The road narrowed, the scenery shifting from open fields to dense, shadowy woods. Daniel's heart began to race. He subtly reached for his phone, but the screen remained dark. No signal. "Are you sure?" Daniel pressed, trying to keep his voice steady. Nikos glanced at him, his smile gone. "Relax. We'll get there." The tension in the car was palpable. Daniel's mind raced, weighing his options. They were in the middle of nowhere. Jumping out of the moving car could be dangerous, but staying felt worse. Then Nikos reached into the glove compartment. For a split second, Daniel's breath caught, fearing the worst. But Nikos only pulled out a pack of cigarettes, lighting one with a shaky hand. The sharp smell of smoke filled the car. "You remind me of my son," Nikos said suddenly, his voice softer but no less unsettling. "He left home years ago. Never came back. I always wondered where he went." Daniel didn't respond, his focus locked on the road ahead. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches clawing at the car as it sped through the narrowing path. Finally, the road opened into a small clearing. Nikos slowed the car to a stop and turned off the engine. The silence was deafening. "We're here," Nikos said, his tone unreadable. Daniel's palms were slick with sweat. "Where's here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nikos didn't answer. He stepped out of the car, walking around to the trunk. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to run, but his body felt frozen. Then he heard the distinct click of the trunk opening. This was his chance. With adrenaline surging, Daniel unbuckled his seatbelt, grabbed his backpack, and threw open the car door. He bolted toward the tree line, the sound of Nikos shouting behind him. The woods were dark and disorienting, but Daniel didn't dare slow down. He zigzagged between trees, hoping to put as much distance as possible between himself and the car. The sound of footsteps behind him grew fainter until they disappeared altogether. Only then did Daniel collapse against a tree, gasping for breath. His heart hammered in his chest as he scanned his surroundings, half expecting Nikos to appear out of the shadows. But the woods remained silent. Hours later, Daniel emerged onto a different road, stumbling into the path of an approaching car. The driver, a kind-faced woman, stopped and helped him into the back seat. Through broken breaths, he explained what had happened. She nodded solemnly, her expression one of concern and understanding. "You're lucky," she said. "Not everyone gets away from people like that." As they drove toward the nearest town, Daniel stared out the window, his mind replaying the harrowing encounter. The memory of Nikos's unsettling smile and cryptic words lingered, a chilling reminder of how quickly trust could turn into danger. Years later, Daniel would share the story as a cautionary tale, a warning about the risks of trusting strangers. Though his adventurous spirit remained, the experience left a mark, shaping the way he approached the open road and the people he met along the way. The Vanishing Camper's Warning. The campsite lay nestled in a secluded valley, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. For Beth and Michael, it was a perfect getaway, private, serene, and far from the noise of civilization. They'd arrived late in the afternoon, setting up their tent near the edge of a tranquil lake. A handful of other campers were scattered across the area, their laughter and campfire songs creating a welcoming ambience. By evening, however, everything changed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Beth noticed something strange. One by one, the other campsites grew quiet. She glanced across the clearing, where a family with 2 kids had been setting up a tent earlier. Now, their spot was deserted, the tent gone without a trace. "Michael, look," Beth said, nudging him. "Where did they go?" Michael frowned, scanning the area. Maybe they left. It's kind of late, though. Beth's unease deepened as she noticed another campsite. A group of friends who'd been playing guitar not long ago was also empty. Their fire had been hastily extinguished, embers still glowing faintly in the darkness. "This is weird," Beth muttered. "Why would everyone leave so suddenly?" Michael shrugged, trying to brush off her concerns. Maybe they got spooked by something. You know how people can be in the woods. But as night fully enveloped the valley, an oppressive stillness settled over the campsite. The cheerful sounds of the day were replaced by an eerie silence. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. The first noise came just after midnight, a faint rustling in the trees, like something moving just out of sight. Beth sat up in her sleeping bag, her heart pounding. "Michael," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" Michael groaned, rubbing his eyes. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though his tone was uncertain. The rustling grew louder, accompanied by a soft, almost rhythmic tapping. Beth's grip tightened on Michael's arm. "That doesn't sound like an animal." Michael unzipped the tent and shone his flashlight toward the trees. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating only the gnarled branches and thick underbrush. The noises stopped instantly, as if whatever had been moving knew it was being watched. "Nothing there," Michael said, though his voice betrayed his unease. He zipped the tent back up and lay down, trying to dismiss the growing sense of dread. But Beth couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. An hour later, the noises returned, louder and more insistent. This time, they were accompanied by something else, a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. Beth and Michael sat bolt upright, their breaths shallow. "What is that?" Beth whispered, her voice trembling. Michael didn't answer. He grabbed the camping knife from his backpack and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The flashlight beam flickered as he scanned the clearing. That's when they saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, motionless and shrouded in shadow. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally elongated, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The hum grew louder, resonating in their chests. "Beth, we need to go," Michael said, his voice tight with fear. Beth didn't argue. They scrambled out of the tent, grabbing only their phones and car keys. The figure didn't move, but the hum seemed to follow them as they sprinted toward their car, parked a short distance away. The couple didn't look back as they climbed into the vehicle. Michael started the engine, his hands shaking, and they sped down the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. Only when they were miles away did the hum finally fade. The next morning, Beth and Michael reported the incident to the local authorities. When park rangers investigated the campsite, they found no signs of the other campers who'd been there earlier. Even the fire pits and footprints were gone, as though no one had been there at all. Beth and Michael never returned to that campsite, but the memory haunted them for years. They often wondered what the other campers had seen or felt that made them leave so abruptly. And what would have happened if they'd stayed just a little longer? Sometimes, Beth would wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced she could hear that low, guttural hum once again. A chilling reminder of the night they narrowly escaped the unknown. And that's a wrap for tonight's collection of chilling tales from the unknown. The great outdoors, as breathtaking as it is, reminds us of its unpredictability, whether through eerie encounters, unexplained phenomena, or moments that test our instincts. What was your favorite story? Or perhaps you have your own experience to share. Drop your thoughts and theories in the comments below. If these stories gave you chills, don't let the adventure end here. Hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications to join us for more haunting tales that blur the line between reality and the supernatural. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe out there.